Pretty much they were in the main room. I heard them dancing and laughing. Kaylee went upstairs and she screamed because someone was in the room. She ran downstairs and I kept calling her name and she wouldn't answer. And then I saw the guy. I actually locked the door and I ran downstairs, but we don't know what's going on.
Just come here. There's two. Looks like fatalities.
I heard her scream and she ran downstairs because she saw someone. That's what I'm pretty sure she said. Someone's here and she screamed and just ran downstairs. And I called for her name, but I jumped up and locked my door because I was so scared. And then I heard someone in the bathroom and I heard her crying and I heard some guy say that you're going to be okay, I'm going to help you. And I kept calling her name, but she wasn't answering. And then I opened the door for a second and I saw this guy and he was not insanely tall, but he was wearing all black and like this mask that was just covering his forehead and his mouth.
Well, get the town. We've got a quadruple homicide.
In the quiet college town of Moscow, Idaho, on a cold November night in 2022, a brutal nightmare unfolded at a house on King Road. For University of Idaho students, Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin were viciously attacked and killed while they slept. The assailant used a large military-style knife, inflicting extensive wounds in a terrifyingly violent encounter. Inside the house, blood-smeared walls and floors told a story of sheer brutality and desperate resistance. Kaylee and Madison were found together in a blood-soaked bed, with Kaylee's face unrecognizable and Madison bearing defensive wounds. Xana lay face down in her room, covered in over 50 stab wounds, having fought fiercely for her life, while Ethan suffered fatal injuries nearby. The crime scene was a haunting tableau of terror and tragedy that forever changed a community, leaving questions that still resonate today. The final hours began like any other Saturday night in Moscow, Idaho. November 12, 2022. A night that should have been filled with laughter, late-night snacks, and the carefree spirit of college life. Instead, it became the prelude to unspeakable horror. Kaylee Gonzalez had driven down from her family home that weekend, excited to show off her new Range Rover to her best friend Madison Mogen. The two had been inseparable since 6th grade, and now, as seniors, they were savoring their final months of college freedom. Kaylee brought Murphy, her beloved golden doodle, along for what was supposed to be a fun weekend reunion. Meanwhile, Xana Kernodle was preparing for a night out with her boyfriend Ethan Chapin. The young couple had found something special together, that kind of love that makes everyone around them smile just watching their interactions. Ethan, a triplet who lived for adventure and brought joy wherever he went, had planned to spend the night at Xana's place after a fraternity party. But someone else was watching. Someone who had been circling this house like a predator stalking prey for months. 23 times, his phone had pinged near this location. 23 times, he had driven through these streets, studying, planning, fantasizing about what he would do when the moment was right. The evening unfolded innocently enough. Kaylee and Madison headed to the Corner Club, a local sports bar where college students gathered to blow off steam. They laughed, they drank, they lived in blissful ignorance of the eyes watching from the shadows. At 1:30 a.m., they left the bar and made their way to the Grub Truck, that beloved late-night food spot where students satisfied their post-party cravings. Security footage would later capture them giggling and chatting as they waited for their order, two best friends enjoying what would be their final moments of pure happiness. The killer was already moving. His white Hyundai Elantra had been spotted circling the neighborhood, making pass after pass like a shark sensing blood in the water. He knew their routines. He knew when they came home. He knew exactly how to get inside. At 1:56 a.m., Kaylee and Madison arrived home via rideshare, completely unaware that death was already closing in. The house on King Road should have been their sanctuary. Instead, it was about to become their tomb. Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk, the two surviving roommates, were already inside. Xana and Ethan had returned from the fraternity party and were settling in for the night. Everything was normal. Everything was safe. Everything was about to shatter into a million pieces. At 4 a.m., Xana placed a DoorDash order. Such an ordinary act, a hungry college student ordering late-night food. The delivery driver would later describe seeing lights on throughout the house, music playing, a female figure moving around the third-floor bathroom window. Life was happening. Innocent, beautiful life. But the predator was already there, lurking in the darkness behind the house. He parked in the back lot, away from prying eyes, away from cameras that might capture his approach. He had studied this house for months. He knew about the sliding glass door that was often left unlocked. He knew the layout. He knew exactly where his victims would be sleeping. At approximately 4:13 a.m., Evil walked through that unlocked door. The attack was swift, brutal, and calculated. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was execution. The killer moved through the house with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment in his mind countless times. He carried a military-style K-bar knife, a weapon designed not just to kill but to devastate. Madison and Kaylee were asleep in Madison's bed on the third floor, two best friends sharing space just like they had as children. The killer found them there, vulnerable and defenseless. Madison, sleeping on the outside of the bed, was likely his first victim. The attack was so sudden, so vicious, that she barely had time to process what was happening. But Kaylee, fierce, fighter Kaylee, she woke up. She tried to escape, but the bed was positioned against the wall, trapping her. She fought with everything she had, but it wasn't enough. The brutality was beyond comprehension. Kaylee suffered over 30 stab wounds. Her face was so disfigured that she was barely recognizable. The killer didn't just want to kill her, he wanted to destroy her. Some unknown weapon, possibly the knife handle or something else entirely, caused blunt force trauma that broke her nose and shattered her facial structure. Even seasoned investigators couldn't immediately comprehend what they were seeing. But the nightmare wasn't over. Somehow, in his frenzy or perhaps drawn by noise, the killer encountered Zana. She had come upstairs, possibly hearing the commotion, possibly just using the kitchen. Phone data shows she was on TikTok until 4:12 a.m. Such a normal, mundane detail that makes what happened next even more horrifying. Security cameras captured the sounds at 4:17 a.m., distorted audio of what sounded like voices. A whimper, then a loud thud that would haunt investigators forever. Zana saw something in that third-floor hallway. She turned away, perhaps not fully understanding what she was witnessing in the darkness. But the killer pursued her, following her down to her second-floor bedroom where Ethan lay sleeping. The attack on Zana was savage beyond description. Over 50 stab wounds, mostly defensive, telling the story of a young woman who fought for her life with desperate courage. Deep gashes on her hands showed how she tried to protect herself from the blade that kept coming, kept slashing, kept destroying. A wound between her pointer finger and thumb cut so deep it seemed to split her hand in half. Ethan never had a chance. The killer struck him while he slept, delivering a fatal blow under his left clavicle that severed multiple vital arteries. But even in death, the killer's rage wasn't satisfied. Deep cuts to the back of Ethan's legs suggested a level of overkill that spoke to something far beyond simple murder. This was the work of someone who took pleasure in causing pain. The most chilling detail? Throughout this massacre, Dylan Mortensen heard sounds that would replay in her nightmares forever. She heard what she thought was Kaylee playing with Murphy. She heard someone say, "There's someone here." She heard crying from Zana's room. And then she heard a male voice, cold and emotionless, saying, "It's okay. I'm going to help you." Words that still send chills down the spine of everyone who hears them. When Dylan finally opened her door, she came face to face with evil itself. A figure dressed in black, wearing a mask, with bushy eyebrows that would become crucial to identifying him later. They locked eyes for a moment that lasted an eternity. He was holding something near his waist, possibly the bloody knife, possibly a gun. He could have killed her too. He could have eliminated the only witness. But something made him turn away, walking past her toward the kitchen and out the sliding glass door he had entered through. Dylan stood frozen in terror as the killer disappeared into the night, leaving behind a scene so horrific that first responders would struggle to process what they were seeing. Blood everywhere, cast-off patterns on the walls and ceilings, arterial spray that painted the rooms in violence. For young lives snuffed out in minutes by a monster who had planned every detail except getting caught. the killer thought he was perfect. He thought he had committed the perfect crime. He had no idea he'd left behind the one piece of evidence that would eventually lead investigators straight to his door: a knife sheath with a microscopic amount of his DNA, dropped next to Madison's body in his haste to escape. For 8 agonizing hours, those who survived shared a house with the dead, never knowing that their friends lay slaughtered just feet away. When help finally arrived, when the truth was finally discovered, when the full scope of this nightmare was finally revealed, even hardened investigators found themselves struggling to understand how one human being could inflict such devastation on 4 innocent souls who had done nothing more than live their lives and follow their dreams. This wasn't just murder. This was the systematic destruction of everything good and pure in the world, carried out by a predator who had been hiding in plain sight, watching, waiting, and planning the perfect moment to unleash hell on earth. While 4 young lives were being celebrated in memorials across the country, investigators began piecing together the disturbing puzzle of who could commit such unspeakable acts. The answer would prove more chilling than anyone could have imagined, not because the killer was some obvious psychopath lurking in shadows, but because he had been hiding in plain sight, masquerading as someone dedicated to understanding the very crimes he would eventually commit. Brian Christopher Kohberger didn't emerge from the stereotypical background of neglect and abuse that often characterizes violent criminals. Born into a middle-class family in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania, he appeared, on the surface, to be just another awkward kid trying to find his place in the world. His parents were hardworking, his siblings seemed normal, and nothing in his early environment screamed, future mass murderer. But beneath that unremarkable exterior, something dark was already taking root. As a teenager, Brian was the kind of kid who seemed to exist on the periphery of everything, not quite fitting in, not quite standing out, but always watching. Classmates from his hometown would later describe him as an outcast, someone who endured relentless bullying throughout his school years. While other kids were forming friendships and discovering themselves, Brian was learning to harbor resentment, to study human behavior from the outside looking in, to nurture grievances that would fester in the darkness of his mind. His online posts from those formative years painted a disturbing picture of a young man wrestling with what he described as emotional numbness. He wrote about feeling like an organic sack of meat with no self-worth, describing his existence as watching his life unfold like a video game he could control without feeling remorse. Even more unsettling was his struggle with visual snow, a neurological condition that created constant static in his vision, making him see the world through a perpetual haze that seemed to mirror his psychological state. During his late teens and early 20s, Brian's life took a dramatic downward spiral. He battled heroin addiction, that soul-crushing disease that strips away humanity piece by piece. But here's where his story takes an interesting turn. Unlike many addicts who remain trapped in cycles of destruction, Brian managed to claw his way out. He got clean, lost a significant amount of weight, and seemed to transform himself entirely. To those who knew him during this period, it looked like a redemption story, a young man who had overcome his demons and was ready to contribute something positive to society. But was he really reformed, or was he simply learning to hide his darkness more effectively? Brian's geographic journey reads like a roadmap to murder. From his troubled youth in Pennsylvania, he made his way to DeSales University, where he began pursuing graduate studies in criminal justice and psychology. Think about that for a moment. A man who would go on to commit one of the most brutal quadruple murders in recent memory was studying the very field dedicated to catching people like him. The irony is so twisted it's almost incomprehensible. It was during his time at DeSales that Brian's fascination with criminal behavior took on a more sinister edge. Fellow students would later report that he seemed obsessed with certain cases, particularly violent crimes involving young women. He conducted research surveys asking convicted criminals about their thought processes, their emotions during their crimes, their feelings of remorse or lack thereof. Was this academic curiosity, or was he conducting research for his future endeavors? In August 2022, just 3 months before the Idaho murders, Brian made a move that would prove fateful for everyone involved. He transferred to Washington State University in Pullman, pursuing his PhD in criminology while working as a teaching assistant. Pullman sits just 10 miles from Moscow, Idaho, close enough to easily scope out potential targets, far enough away to maintain the illusion of separation. To his new classmates and colleagues at WSU, Brian initially appeared to be just another graduate student grinding through his studies. He was described as gregarious by some, though others found him off-putting in ways they couldn't quite articulate. But as the semester progressed, faculty members began expressing concerns about his behavior, particularly his interactions with female students. The contrast between Brian's public persona and his private reality was stark and terrifying. Publicly, he was a scholar of criminal justice, someone supposedly dedicated to understanding crime in order to prevent it. He participated in class discussions about criminal behavior, wrote papers on the psychology of offenders, and presented himself as someone genuinely interested in making the world safer. Privately, he was conducting surveillance missions that would make a professional stalker envious. Brian's living situation provided the perfect cover for his increasingly disturbing activities. His graduate housing apartment in Pullman gave him a respectable address and academic credentials that deflected suspicion. He had the financial means to maintain his white Hyundai Elantra and the freedom that comes with being a graduate student: flexible schedules, minimal oversight, and the ability to come and go as he pleased without raising eyebrows. His social circles were limited but strategically chosen. He gravitated toward academic environments where his interest in criminal psychology could be discussed openly without seeming suspicious. He engaged with professors and fellow students about violent crime, asking probing questions about methodology, victim selection, and crime scene analysis. To them, he was simply a dedicated student. In reality, he was gathering intelligence for his own dark purposes. The warning signs were there, subtle but present for those who knew how to look. Female students in his classes began complaining about his behavior, the way he would stare, his dismissive and sometimes hostile attitude toward women, his tendency to make inappropriate comments. Faculty members noted his fixation on certain types of crimes and his unsettling questions about victim psychology. But perhaps the most chilling warning sign was his online activity. Brian spent time researching cases involving home invasions, knife attacks, and crimes targeting young women. He studied the Elliot Rodger case with particular intensity, the self-proclaimed incel, who killed 6 people in a shooting and stabbing rampage near UC Santa Barbara. Rodger had expressed a specific desire to enter a sorority house and kill every woman inside, a fantasy he was unable to fulfill during his actual attack. Brian's cell phone data revealed a pattern of behavior that, in hindsight, reads like a masterclass in criminal stalking. Starting in July 2022, his phone began pinging near the victim's residence on King Road. 23 separate occasions between July and November, always during the late night or early morning hours when potential victims would be most vulnerable. Each visit was a reconnaissance mission, each drive-by an opportunity to study patterns, routines, and vulnerabilities. The most disturbing aspect of Brian's background isn't what he did. It's how successfully he hid what he was planning to do. He maintained his academic standing, kept up appearances with family and friends, and continued his research into criminal behavior while simultaneously planning to become the very type of criminal he was studying. The level of compartmentalization required for such deception suggests a mind capable of profound manipulation and control. When Brian drove across the country with his father for Christmas break in December 2022, just weeks after committing a quadruple murder, he appeared to be just another graduate student heading home for the holidays. His father saw nothing unusual in his behavior, noticed no signs of the monster his son had become. Even when they were pulled over twice for traffic violations during their journey, stops that were likely part of FBI surveillance, Brian maintained his composure, acting like any ordinary citizen dealing with routine police encounters. The most terrifying realization about Brian Kohberger is that he represents a new breed of criminal, highly educated, socially functional on the surface, and sophisticated enough to nearly get away with mass murder. He didn't fit the profile of a disorganized killer acting on impulse. Instead, he demonstrated the methodical planning and execution capabilities of someone who had studied exactly how to commit the perfect crime. Unfortunately for his victims, he had almost succeeded. What makes the Idaho Student Murders so bone-chillingly terrifying isn't just the brutality of the acts themselves. It's the methodical precision with which they were carried out. This wasn't a crime of passion or a random act of violence. This was the culmination of months of meticulous planning, surveillance, and psychological preparation by someone who had turned murder into a science project. The first known incident that would eventually lead to the King Road massacre didn't happen in November 2022. It began the moment Bryan Kohberger set foot in Pullman, Washington, in August 2022. Within days of his arrival, his phone started pinging near the victim's neighborhood, not randomly, but with the systematic regularity of someone conducting surveillance operations. But to understand how this monster operated, we need to look even further back, to March 2022, when Bryan was still living in Pennsylvania. That's when he made a purchase that would prove crucial to his future crimes. A K-bar military-style knife, complete with a tactical sheath. This wasn't an impulse buy or a collector's item. This was a weapon specifically chosen for its ability to inflict maximum damage with surgical precision. Think about the psychological implications of that timeline. In March, while still 3,000 miles away from his eventual victims, Bryan was already planning murder. He spent months carrying that knife, familiarizing himself with its weight, its balance, its lethal potential. By the time he arrived in Washington, he was already mentally prepared to kill. His victim selection criteria revealed a mind that had studied predatory behavior with academic thoroughness. Bryan didn't choose his targets randomly. He selected them with the cold calculation of someone who understood exactly what he was looking for. Young, attractive college women living in an environment that offered both access and vulnerability. The King Road house was perfect. A party house with multiple residents, frequent visitors, and security habits that were lax enough to provide opportunities for someone patient enough to wait for the right moment. The victims fit a specific demographic profile that seemed to appeal to Bryan's particular pathology. They were successful, popular, seemingly happy young women living the kind of college experience that someone like Bryan, awkward, isolated, resentful, might view with a mixture of envy and rage. They represented everything he felt denied in his own social experience, making them perfect targets for someone whose psychological drivers included deep-seated resentment toward those who seemed to have it all. The most disturbing aspect of Bryan's crime pattern development is how it reveals the vulnerabilities in our assumptions about safety and security. He proved that with enough patience, planning, and psychological sophistication, even the most horrific crimes can be carried out by someone who appears completely normal on the surface. His ability to compartmentalize his academic life from his criminal planning, his skill at maintaining normal relationships while conducting surveillance operations, and his success at avoiding detection for months before the murders all point to a level of criminal sophistication that challenges our understanding of how monsters operate in modern society. The Idaho murders weren't an aberration or a moment of lost control. They were the inevitable culmination of a methodical process that had been years in the making, executed by someone who had turned the study of criminal behavior into a blueprint for committing the perfect crime. Unfortunately for 4 innocent victims, his methodology was nearly flawless. The investigation into the Idaho student murders would become one of the most complex and intense manhunts in modern American law enforcement history. What began as a horrifying crime scene discovery on a Sunday morning would evolve into a multi-agency operation involving hundreds of investigators, cutting-edge forensic technology, and a level of public scrutiny that turned every piece of evidence into front-page news. When Moscow police officers first arrived at 1122 King Road on November 13, 2022, they encountered a scene that would haunt even the most experienced investigators. The evidence catalog they began compiling that day would eventually fill hundreds of pages and include some of the most crucial forensic discoveries in recent criminal history. The physical evidence painted a picture of calculated brutality that defied comprehension. Blood spatter patterns covered walls and ceilings throughout multiple rooms, with arterial spray patterns indicating the savage nature of the attacks. Cast-off blood evidence showed the killer's movements through the house, creating a macabre roadmap of his deadly progression from room to room. But it was a small, seemingly insignificant piece of evidence that would ultimately crack the case wide open. Next to Madison Mogen's body, investigators discovered a tan leather knife sheath, the kind used to protect a military-style K-bar blade. The killer had been so methodical in his planning, so careful in his execution, yet in his haste to escape, he had made the one mistake that would lead authorities straight to his door. The sheath contained a microscopic amount of DNA, not visible to the naked eye, but detectable through advanced forensic testing. That tiny genetic signature would prove to be the thread that, when pulled, would unravel Bryan Kohberger's entire web of deception. Digital evidence collection revealed the scope of the killer's surveillance operations. Cell tower data showed that starting in July 2022, a phone registered to Brian Kohberger had pinged near the King Road residence 23 separate times, always during late night or early morning hours when potential victims would be most vulnerable. This wasn't random movement, this was systematic reconnaissance. The most damning digital evidence came from the morning of the murders themselves. Brian's phone had disconnected from the cellular network near Pullman at 2:47 a.m., remaining dark during the time frame when the murders occurred. The phone reconnected at 4:48 a.m. near Blaine, Idaho, about 20 miles south of Moscow, as if someone had powered it back on after completing a task they didn't want tracked. Even more chilling was what investigators discovered about Brian's activities immediately after the murders. At approximately 9 a.m., just hours after committing a quadruple homicide, his phone showed him taking a selfie in his bathroom, a thumbs-up pose that suggested either complete disconnect from reality or chilling satisfaction with his night's work. Vehicle identification became another crucial component of the investigation. Surveillance cameras throughout the area had captured footage of a white sedan making multiple passes through the neighborhood in the early morning hours of November 13th. The car appeared around 3:30 a.m., circulating through the area with the persistence of someone searching for the perfect opportunity. At 4:04 a.m., the vehicle pulled up behind the King Road house and remained there for approximately 16 minutes, the exact time frame during which the murders occurred. At 4:20 a.m., cameras captured the same vehicle speeding away from the scene, nearly losing control while taking a corner in what appeared to be a desperate escape. Investigators painstakingly reviewed over 22,000 vehicle registration records to identify white Hyundai Elantras in the region. When they narrowed their search to vehicles registered in Pennsylvania, a state that doesn't require front license plates, matching the suspect vehicle, Brian Kohberger's name emerged as a person of interest. The timeline reconstruction process revealed the methodical nature of Brian's planning and execution. Starting with his arrival in Washington in August 2022, investigators traced his movements through cell phone data, surveillance footage, and witness accounts. The pattern that emerged was terrifying in its consistency: regular reconnaissance visits to the target area, each one building his knowledge of victim routines and security vulnerabilities. The night of the murders showed military-level precision in timing and execution. Brian left his apartment in Pullman around 2:50 a.m., with his phone going dark just before he began his approach to the King Road house. He struck during the narrow window between 4 a.m., when Zana's DoorDash order was delivered, and 4:20 a.m., when Dylan Mortensen encountered him leaving the scene. Forensic analysis of the crime scene revealed details that painted a picture of unprecedented brutality. The victims had suffered a combined total of over 100 stab wounds, with Kaylee receiving the most savage treatment. Her injuries were so severe that her face was rendered unrecognizable. Zana showed over 50 defensive wounds, telling the story of a young woman who fought desperately for her life. The medical examiner's findings confirmed that the weapon used was consistent with a K-bar military knife, the same type of blade that would have fit the sheath found at the scene. The wounds showed characteristics that matched both the tip and guard of such a weapon, providing crucial evidence linking the crime scene discovery to the murder weapon. Witness interviews revealed a community that had been living under threat without fully realizing it. Multiple residents reported seeing suspicious activity in the weeks leading up to the murders. A neighbor walking his dog between 9 o'clock and 11 a.m. on the morning of November 13th observed the front door of the King Road house standing wide open, unusual enough that he remembered it clearly and reported it to police. Perhaps the most crucial witness was Dylan Mortensen herself, whose testimony provided the only eyewitness account of the killer. Her description of a male figure approximately 5 feet 10 inches tall, athletically built, wearing all black with a mask covering his mouth and nose, and having bushy eyebrows, would prove essential in identifying Brian Kohberger when he was eventually located. The DoorDash driver who delivered food to the house at 4 a.m. became an unexpected key witness. Her detailed account of seeing lights on throughout the house, observing a female figure in the third-floor bathroom window, and spending approximately 15 minutes in the area provided crucial timeline confirmation. The arrest of Brian Christopher Kohberger on December 30th, 2022, marked the end of a 47-day nightmare that had gripped not just Moscow, Idaho, but the entire nation. When Pennsylvania State Police surrounded the Koberger family home in the Pocono Mountains, they found their suspect calmly packing trash into Ziploc bags while wearing surgical gloves, behavior that spoke to either obsessive-compulsive tendencies or a guilty conscience attempting to eliminate evidence. The initial charges were as severe as the crimes themselves: 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary. The prosecution wasted no time in announcing its intention to seek the death penalty, a decision that would add years of complexity to what was already shaping up to be one of the most closely watched legal proceedings in recent memory. Brian's defense strategy initially centered on a complete denial of involvement, despite the mounting evidence against him. His attorneys argued that their client was simply a night owl who enjoyed driving around the countryside, an explanation that might have seemed plausible if not for the 23 documented occasions his phone had pinged near the victim's residence, always during the predatory hours when most people were safely asleep. The defense team faced an almost impossible task: explaining away DNA evidence, cell phone data, surveillance footage, and eyewitness testimony that all pointed to their client's guilt. Their strategy evolved from outright denial to claims of rushed investigation and circumstantial evidence. But the prosecution's case was building into an avalanche of scientific proof that would prove virtually insurmountable. During his arraignment on May 22, 2023, Brian employed an unusual legal tactic called standing silent, refusing to enter a plea and forcing the judge to enter not guilty pleas on his behalf. This maneuver, rarely used in Idaho courts, suggested either a sophisticated legal strategy or a defendant so detached from reality that he couldn't acknowledge the charges against him. The trial's complexity was compounded by intense media attention and the defendant's academic background in criminology. Brian's understanding of legal procedures and forensic science enabled him to actively participate in his own defense in ways that most defendants cannot. His knowledge of criminal investigation techniques also raised questions about whether he had deliberately attempted to manipulate evidence or crime scene details to confuse investigators. Appeals and pre-trial motions stretched the legal proceedings across multiple years, creating additional trauma for the victims' families who desperately wanted closure. Brian's defense team filed numerous challenges to the evidence, the investigative methods, and even the court's jurisdiction. Each motion represented another delay, another postponement of justice for families already shattered by unimaginable loss. The death penalty aspect of the case added layers of complexity that transformed what might have been a straightforward murder trial into a years-long legal odyssey. Capital punishment proceedings require exhaustive examination of every piece of evidence, extensive jury selection processes, and automatic appeals that can stretch for decades. For families seeking swift justice, the legal system's deliberate pace became another form of torture. However, in a stunning turn that shocked legal observers and divided the victims' families, Brian Koberger ultimately accepted a plea deal on July 2, 2025. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, he pleaded guilty to all charges and accepted 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years for the burglary conviction. The plea hearing itself was a study in cold calculation. When asked directly by the judge if he had killed Madison Mogen, Kaylee Gonzalez, Zana Kernadle, and Ethan Chapin, Brian answered with simple, emotionless yes responses that provided no explanation, no remorse, and no closure for the families desperate to understand why their children had to die. The final irony was that Brian, who had spent years studying criminal justice and believed he could commit the perfect crime, ultimately found himself subject to the very system he thought he understood. His academic knowledge couldn't overcome the relentless pursuit of investigators determined to bring him to justice, and his calculated plea deal became his final admission that even the most carefully planned crimes leave traces that skilled law enforcement can follow back to their source. In the end, justice was served not through the dramatic courtroom confrontation that many expected, but through the quiet acknowledgement of guilt from a man who had tried to play God with innocent lives and lost.